One of the most commonly asked questions in violin making is, what sort of wood can you use to make a violin? So, hello, Graham Vincent, violin maker and musician. It's been absolutely ages since I did a video, I think, and I was trying to work out why. And I think the only reason I could think of is basically that I've kind of become a little bit obsessed with the quality of the video, and I've decided to pretty much ignore all the editing and everything, which exactly like I used to, and just turn on record, have a chat, and just talk about something. And what I used to do in the past, I'll probably do again, is almost not even, unless I could remember that I'd made some really stupid mistake, not even go back and listen to the video before I post it. So that's the way I'm going to do it. And I'm just going to try and get used to that, just being a little bit more laissez-faire, if you like, about how I do videos. I think that would be a good idea. So anyway, yeah. So I'm just working on edge work at the moment, but that's not what I wanted to talk about. What I thought I'd talk about is one of the most commonly asked questions in there's a light shining in your eyes, so to speak. That's better. One of the most commonly asked questions in violin making is, what sort of wood can you use to make a violin? So, right. I mean, my type of violin making is a little bit more avant-garde, a little bit more off centre from the main part of the violin world, shall we say. So I've just grabbed this off the shelf. This is a cheap sort of probably start of the 20th century, maybe about then, sort of bohemian probably violin. It's traditional, and it fits in with the sort of traditional classical music, sort of solo sort of classical pieces, duets, quartets, chamber orchestras, symphonies, all that sort of symphony orchestra, all that sort of stuff, where you want a violin that looks like a normal violin and that puts you firmly amongst the flock, so to speak. So that sort of violin would have almost universally, with one or two little exceptions which we will cover, but generally, if you want to be accepted by the violin gang, so to speak, then it's going to be a European maple, ideally with a nice figuring. That would be for the back, the sides, the neck, peg box and scroll, which would all be one piece, unless it's a modified earlier violin. The back may be made of two pieces, so as this one is, so it's book matched. That is to say, you take one piece, you cut it down the center, and then you open it like a book, so that the grain is sort of, as it sort of says, a book matching, a mirror along the center line. And generally it's deemed to be good to have a nice sort of rippled figure. The cheaper pieces of this rippled maple are like this one, as much as the rippling, the figure is fairly uneven. The back can also be done in a single one piece of maple, and that generally will be slab cut. And so, because of the way this figuring goes throughout the tree, the actual ripple will be less consistent and will be almost more like waves, because each individual flame won't necessarily carry right the way across the back. So anyway, then the front would almost invariably be a spruce. The bridge would be a sort of a highly figured maple with a very prominent sort of display of medullary rays, and generally without any ripple figure. Then all the black bits would be ebony. Generally nowadays people are sort of trying to move away from ebony because it's a very slow growing tree. The black parts of ebony are only a very small proportion of the ebony out there, and so often trees are cut down only to find it's not able to be used. So it's a very wasteful and diminishing resource. So I personally, for example, use even on classical violins, I use a sort of a compressed treated bamboo product, which is fantastic. Sometimes you'll see a sort of more brown looking sort of tuning pegs and chin rests and so on, and that is generally either going to be a sort of rosewood style thing or a boxwood style thing, both of which are under sort of ecological pressure as well. Apart from that, there's also a bit of purfling, which can be stained wood, can actually be coloured wood, but anyway. So in terms of the quality of the wood, because I mean that's the type of wood, but then what defines a good piece of spruce and a bad piece of spruce? Okay, whatever wood you're using, for me there is one defining characteristic which comes in above everything else, and that is the piece of wood should be ringy, it should resonate. And the reason I say this is because if a piece of wood doesn't resonate, then it won't resonate within the instrument. Once you've built it into an instrument, it'll be like a sound absorber, some sort of shock absorber within the system. So I've just grabbed a piece of reclaimed spruce off the shelf over there. I tend to use a lot of reclaimed timbers. This particular piece is a drawer bottom, and in fact it still has some of the lining paper from the drawer on one side of it. So once that's taken off, it'll be even more resonant. But this has got a lot of good characteristics about it. First of all, I don't know if you can hear that, but when you run your fingers over the surface, if you can hear this almost sort of fizzing sort of sound, a hiss, a high-pitched hiss coming from the piece of wood, that's normally really good. And then the other thing is, does it resonate? Does it ring? I'm sure you can hear that. So that's a really important test. Then with spruce, for example, there's a sort of a density above which you don't want to go and a density below which you don't want to go. It's nice if it falls within a sort of a fairly standard kind of central sort of area. And also grain, the actual width of the grain. Let me see if you can see this from here. These two pieces here, which have been glued together, are fine for what I'm using this for, because this will be turned into linings, because it's not a very thick piece of wood, but it's ideal for linings. But this fairly open grain here wouldn't be suitable for a violin front, whereas this actually would be pretty ideal. It's a really nice looking kind of figure. What else? Can you see these like shiny sort of, there's a sort of, you've got the grain running up and down, but you've almost got these sort of flecks running sideways as well. That tells you that this is really fairly quarter sawn. That is to say, though, if that's the thickness of the piece of wood, those annual rings are running pretty much straight through it. So it's sawn in a pattern radiating from the centre of the tree, so to speak. So the annual rings are cut through at 90 degrees. So that's a really nice bit of old reclaimed timber. And you use that sort of test for maple as well. It should be not too dense, not too light. It should resonate and it should look nice. Looking nice can be, a nice size of flame, a nice even flame, all those sort of things. In terms of ebony, we will talk about ebony, even though it's something I avoid basically because I don't nowadays tend to use anything that's come out of a rainforest. But ebony, in an ideal world, wants to be really black, really even, and with very little pore structure visible. That kind of real high quality ebony is very hard to get nowadays. One of the reasons a lot of people are trying to find alternatives is not because they're driven by some green sort of morals, it's because they can't find the stuff they need. So anyway, personally I would try and that's fairly typical. One of the joys about using the phone for recording video, which I do, is of course when the phone rings the video gets cut off, and there we go. So I think I was talking about ebony. Yeah, shall we assume I'd finished talking about ebony? I'm not sure, but so those are the basics of what goes into a standard sort of violin. Then one of the joys about being a violin maker is you love making things, and ideally you keep them all, but obviously you make money by selling them. So the reason I mention that is I have not even one violin that I've made to sort of demonstrate anything with, but there's one I am making. Nice piece of ash. Interesting. So the wood choices that I go for are slightly different from the standard. I do occasionally make completely standard classical violins when they're asked for, but I've always been fascinated in doing things slightly differently. Almost whatever I approach, I tend to sort of try and do something else. I guess it's a mental challenge for me or something. I don't know why I do it, but it's my nature. So with violin making, I've tended to go for reclaimed materials. I've tended to go for odd materials like the ash that you just seen, like bog oak. If I'm clever, I'll actually drop in some photographs as I go. So bog oak. I've made a couple of violins in bog oak. This is the particular one that I'm using. It's like a sort of 4,000-year-old piece of timber. It's just extraordinary that you can, pick up a violin in something that old. And I'll get back to why I like that in a minute. I've also made violins in wormy chestnut, for example, which is the Americans watching this will understand what that's about. I mean, basically, there was a chestnut blight swept across North America at the start of the 20th century and killed, I think it was many millions of chestnut trees. And because there's a lot of timber in North America, or was at the time, they tended to just get left standing there. And it's a very rot resistant sort of timber. And also fairly resistant to insect attack, but there's some types of beetle that quite happily chew through it. And 20-30 years after the blight had sort of swept through the place and killed most of the trees, people realized there was a lot of this standing timber that was now seasoned and was completely usable still, so they started using it. And it's characterized by having sort of wormholes through it, and of course, because these wormholes may have happened over decades before it was cut down, they're often very black sort of wormholes. Again, I'll try and get a picture up. But it's a nice, stiff, light, very resonant timber. And I made 2 violins for a family of farmers in the States who, it was the grandfather of the chap who commissioned the violins, had cut the tree down, made a barn. His father knocked the barn down, reused some of the timber for an extension on the house. He knocked the extension down to build a larger extension and found some of this timber. So it's timber with a really important place in American history, and also a very important place in that family's history. So that was a fabulous thing to make a couple of instruments from. I've made Spanish cedar, that's Cedrilla odorata violins, because again, if you probably come across cigar box guitars, for example, cigar box violins. very primitive instruments made using old cigar boxes, and they often sound surprisingly good. And the reason for that is it's a really nice, resilient, resonant, stiff timbre, perfect for violin making. So, I mean, I kind of questioned myself about, why do these cigar box instruments sound so good? And so I made a classical violin, which hopefully, again, I'll put a picture up on screen, using that. And yeah, it sounded great. I've made several of them now, and also some guitar-shaped ones, and they sound really good. What else have I used? I've used all sorts of... I've made a couple in balsa wood as a real experiment, and that they were surprisingly good. I have made violins in beech, often considered to be a fairly cheap violin making timbre, but I mean, Guarneri and even Stradivarius did make one or two using beech. It's actually a really suitable timbre for violin making. What else have I made violins in? I'm going to miss a whole load of things here. Oh, the other thing I have done is I've used hardwood for the fronts on quite a number of instruments. On the Spanish cedar violins, for example, the whole of the body is made in Spanish cedar. It's a really lightweight, kind of resonant, stiff timbre, and that was kind of an easy thing to do, to move towards, because the cigar box ones have sort of cedar fronts. So anyway, I did that, and since then I've also made bog oak violins, entirely out of bog oak. And again, if I get clever on the editing front, hopefully you'll see some images now. And an ash, a figured ash octave violin, for example, using ash on the front. So yeah, but let's start with the important bit. It's got to be resonant. So, for example, this is a piece of timber that I will use at some stage. I've got a lot of this. Someone gave me a piece of furniture made out of this. Doesn't look very promising. This was, I think, made in the 1960s. But almost wherever you hold it, you'll get a resonance, a different sort of resonance from. It's quite happily produce all sorts of octaves and what have you. And again, it's got that hiss, that sort of high frequency response as well to touch. So but it is a very dense timber, but so is ash, and maple isn't exactly that light. And the bog oak that I used, that's incredibly dense, really. Probably about the same as this, but this is a really strong timber, as bog oak is, for example, and you just compensate for the extra weight, the density, by making the front and back plates and the ribs just that little bit thinner, which reduce the weight. It seems to work really well. So yeah, I'm looking forward to making something out of this at some stage. And there are other the not using dense woods is one of those things that's seems to have become a bit of an oft repeated thing in violin making, which doesn't seem to have anything to back it up. It's just it's started being said, so people say it, and then it becomes folklore, if you like. But look at other instruments, for example, classical guitars, other guitars. I mean, they are made, some of the best ones are made with rosewood and similar really high density sort of timbers for the backs and sides. So, it's not without precedent. Now, I realise that a guitar and a violin are fundamentally different types of instruments, and the way that the energy is put into them is completely different. A guitar is plucked and has to maintain a sustain, whereas a violin is a constantly driven sort of power system, which just has to amplify what's going into it. So I understand all of that. God, I'm starting to ramble. I am actually trying to keep to specific down the rail, down the centre without the side branches. But anyway, what I was going to say was with reclaimed timber, with some of these other choices of timber, for me, a story is the main part of it. And for example, those violins made from the wormy chestnut for that farming family, that means something to them very much. There's a real family history sort of built into those violins. The sort of bog oak violins that I've made, when you pick that up, you know you're holding possibly up to 4,000 years in your hands, sort of older than the pyramids. It's just extraordinary. You can't escape from having a slight sense of wonder when you pick that up, when you realise what it is you're holding, what it means in terms of the place in history where this tree actually grew. So there are many reasons for choosing different types of timber. Like I say, here we go. Let's do a summary. Basically, many reasons for choosing different types of timber, but no timber is going to work if it's not resonant. So it must be resonant. If you want to be making violins for what I described as the flock, and I didn't mean it in a derogatory sort of way, but a lot of violin playing, the violin needs to sit within a tradition, and so you don't necessarily want to fly in the face of that, so you will produce the very traditional instrument, so spruce, maple, dark sort of fittings, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It is the most beautiful and wonderful instrument and continues to inspire me massively. But if you are then moving outside of that, and oddballs like me tend to do that, then again, choose based on the suitability of the timber. That is to say, is it resonant? Is it structurally sound? Do you like it? Does it have a story? And the other thing I would mention, I don't want to give away my trade secrets and so on here, but just consider this as a last point. If someone wants a violin with a maple back and a spruce front, how many violins have they got to choose from? 99.99999% of violins are going to be that category. If someone wants something a bit special, if they are one of the maybe 1% of the violin playing community who actually would quite like to stand out, then what choice do they have? A very, very, very small choice. So just purely on a practical and marketing sort of basis, it does make sense to be a bit of an oddball. That's my thinking anyway. Because the minute, how can I put it? If you're making it in maple and spruce, you're not only competing with all the Chinese factories, all the violin makers who buy stuff in from China and varnish it, all the makers who make instruments, but you're also competing with all the historical instruments. If someone wants an ash violin, for example, or is the sort who could be talked into that, then they don't have much choice. So, gosh, I've suddenly sounded like a really scheming, nasty capitalist, haven't I? That isn't what drives me. Otherwise, I wouldn't be violin making. But I guess it was just something that I came to realise as I was making all these oddball instruments. It actually wasn't a handicap, because I'd kind of felt it was, and then I realised no, it was possibly gave me an advantage, but certainly didn't give me a disadvantage anyway. So that's it really. I better get on. I got work to do. Yeah, it's actually been really nice talking to the camera again for the first time in ages. I will be doing more of it again. Thank you all for your patience, and thank you for watching. If you've watched this far through the video, thank you very much indeed. And yeah, look after yourselves. Talk to you again soon. Cheers, folks. Bye.